The courtroom is filled with tension as Keanu Reeves sits at the defense table. His hands tremble slightly, and his face shows signs of worry, as he faces serious accusations of financial misconduct. If he's found guilty, it would destroy his career and reputation forever. The public defender, sitting beside him, looks overwhelmed. She struggles to keep up with the fast-paced and aggressive accusations coming from the prosecution. The weight of the case is clearly getting to her, and it's obvious she's not prepared for the battle ahead. Keanu, however, remains calm and composed. Dressed simply in a suit, he doesn't draw attention to himself. He watches quietly as the prosecution builds its case, focused but not reacting. His demeanor is the complete opposite of the chaos around him, making it clear that he is ready for whatever comes next, no matter how intense it may get. Judge Richard Holloway was a figure who commanded respect in the courtroom. Known for his harsh rulings and no-nonsense attitude, he had earned a reputation for making quick, brutal decisions. As he looked across the room, his sharp eyes landed on Keanu Reeves, the defendant sitting quietly at the defense table. A small smirk appeared on his face, and he leaned back in his chair, clearly ready to make an impression. "Well, well," Judge Holloway said, his voice full of mockery, "it seems we have royalty in our courtroom today." His eyes scanned Keanu with amusement. "I imagine you're here for extra credit, son. Learning the ropes, perhaps?" His tone was dripping with sarcasm, and a few chuckles could be heard from the gallery. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't respond right away, letting the judge's words hang in the air. The courtroom was tense, but Keanu remained calm, his hands resting on the table in front of him. He didn't allow the judge's mockery to throw him off. His posture was still, his expression unreadable. Judge Holloway continued, clearly enjoying the attention. "Tell me, do you think sitting in a courtroom will teach you more than your family's lawyers already have?" The room erupted in laughter, with the prosecutor, Ethan Wallace, even cracking a smile. But Keanu didn't play into it. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, and his eyes locked with the judge's. His voice was steady, calm, and unshaken. "I'm here," he said, his words cutting through the laughter, "because justice doesn't belong to those who speak the loudest, but to those who speak the truth." The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. The mocking laughter died instantly. Judge Holloway's smirk faltered, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He leaned forward, clearly taken aback by Keanu's response. The air in the room had shifted. The prosecutor, Wallace, who had been enjoying the judge's remarks, now seemed unsure of how to react. The jury members looked up, their attention fully on Keanu. Even the bailiff, who had been standing casually, seemed to pay more attention. Judge Holloway recovered quickly, but the earlier confidence in his voice was gone. "Well," he said with a scoff, "let's see how your little justice holds up when the real attorneys get to work." He motioned toward the prosecution, a clear attempt to regain control of the courtroom. But his words, once filled with confidence, now seemed to carry a hint of doubt. Keanu's response had done something powerful, it had changed the mood in the room. The atmosphere was no longer filled with the easy confidence of those who thought they had already won. Instead, there was an air of anticipation, a sense that the tide could turn. Keanu had taken control of the moment, and everyone in the room could feel it. The judge, once so sure of himself, now seemed more guarded. The prosecutor, who had been certain of his victory, stood a little straighter, aware that this trial was not going to be as easy as he had thought. The jury leaned forward, sensing that something big was about to unfold. Keanu, in that one moment, had shown everyone that he wasn't just an intern, he was a force to be reckoned with. And the game was only just beginning. Ethan Wallace, the prosecutor, stood up with an air of complete confidence. He straightened his tie, his expression cool and composed as he turned toward the jury. He knew this case was in the bag, and he was ready to make that clear. With a smooth, calm voice, he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Wallace began, his tone even and authoritative, "this case is not complicated. It's clear, straightforward, and simple. The defendant, Keanu Reeves, thought he could outsmart the law. But the evidence is undeniable." He paused for a moment to let his words sink in. "This is a case about greed, deception, and a man who believed he could get away with it all." Wallace took a few steps toward the table, making sure to catch the jury's attention. He picked up a stack of forensic reports, waving them in the air as he spoke. "We have forensic evidence, solid reports that prove the financial fraud. We have witnesses who will testify against the defendant. And we have a paper trail that leaves no room for doubt." He glanced toward Keanu, whose calm demeanor remained unchanged, despite the mounting accusations. Keanu Reeves tried to flee from justice when the authorities came to question him. He thought he could escape, but he was wrong. He looked back at the jury, a smug smile creeping onto his face. "This case is as clear as day. The evidence against the defendant is overwhelming, and the truth is undeniable. There is no question here. The defendant is guilty." The judge, Richard Holloway, who had been listening intently, nodded in approval. His sharp eyes flicked between the prosecutor and the jury, as though agreeing with Wallace's every word. A slight smirk crossed his face, and he leaned back in his chair. "Well said, Mr. Wallace," Judge Holloway added, his voice cutting through the courtroom. "I must say, I'm impressed. It seems like the case is already decided." His tone was dripping with sarcasm as he cast a final glance at Keanu, clearly mocking the defendant. "This should be an easy win." The prosecutor beamed at the judge's approval, clearly pleased with the way things were going. He knew the courtroom was on his side, and with the judge backing him up, he was sure the jury would see things his way. Keanu's calmness only seemed to strengthen their belief that he was guilty. The courtroom buzzed with the certainty of Wallace's argument, and no one seemed to doubt that the case was already closed. As the prosecutor, Ethan Wallace, wrapped up his confident statements, the courtroom was filled with a sense of certainty. It seemed like the case was already decided in the prosecution's favor. The judge, Holloway, was clearly pleased with how the trial was going. The jury was on edge, leaning in, convinced that Keanu Reeves was about to be found guilty. The atmosphere was tense, but there was no hint of what was about to happen. Then, at the peak of the prosecutor's confidence, something unexpected occurred. Keanu Reeves, the defendant, who had been sitting quietly at the defense table, calmly stood up. His movement was so subtle that it took a moment for everyone in the room to realize what was happening. The entire courtroom went silent. All eyes turned toward him. Keanu's voice broke the silence, steady and controlled. "I will be handling the defense," he said clearly, with no hint of hesitation. The words were simple but firm. He wasn't waiting for permission, he wasn't asking. He was taking charge. A wave of surprise rippled through the room. The judge, Richard Holloway, was taken aback. He stared at Keanu for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, unsure of what he had just heard. "Excuse me?" Holloway's voice cut through the quiet room, his disbelief obvious. "You're going to defend yourself?" There was a slight chuckle from the prosecution's side, as if they found the idea laughable. The jury exchanged confused glances. Keanu, still standing, met the judge's gaze with calm confidence. There was no nervousness, no second-guessing, just a quiet assurance that he was ready for what was to come. "Yes, Your Honor," Keanu replied without hesitation. "I am ready." Keanu's response caused an immediate shift in the room. Judge Holloway, who had been in control of the courtroom, now seemed unsure. He glanced over at the prosecutor, who was clearly surprised by the bold move, before turning back to Keanu. "You're an intern," the judge said, his voice laced with doubt. "What makes you think you're qualified to handle this case?" Keanu didn't flinch at the judge's question. He simply looked at him and replied, "Justice isn't about experience, it's about truth. And I'm here to seek the truth." There was an uncomfortable pause. The judge, still skeptical, leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to regain his composure. But the air in the room had shifted. No longer was Keanu just an intern, sitting quietly in the background. He had stepped into the spotlight, and all eyes were now on him. The atmosphere was charged with a new energy, one that hadn't been there before. The prosecution, once confident and sure of their victory, now looked slightly rattled. Ethan Wallace raised an eyebrow, but he didn't interrupt. The jury, too, was paying closer attention. What had seemed like an easy case was now filled with uncertainty. Keanu was no longer just a defendant being judged by the court, he had become an active participant in the trial, and the power in the room had shifted. Keanu, calm and composed, was standing tall in the center of the courtroom, ready to take on whatever came next. The quiet intern had now become the focal point of the trial, and it was clear that this case was no longer going to go the way anyone had expected. Keanu stood tall, his confidence unwavering as he began to present his defense. The courtroom, which had been filled with the prosecution's certainty, now felt like a different place. He didn't waste any time. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Keanu began, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "I'm here to show you that the case against me is based on a lie, a mistake that should have never made it this far." Keanu's words caught everyone's attention. The prosecutor, Ethan Wallace, watched closely, his eyes narrowing as Keanu began to speak. Keanu didn't look at the prosecutor or the judge, focusing only on the jury as he continued. He picked up a set of documents from the table and held them up, turning to face the jury. "This," Keanu said, holding up a sheet of paper, "is part of the prosecution's key evidence. It shows the exact time of the alleged fraudulent transaction. But there's a problem with it." A murmur ran through the courtroom as people exchanged confused glances. Keanu wasn't just going to argue his innocence, he was going to prove it with cold, hard facts. He turned toward the screen at the front of the courtroom and pointed to a timestamp displayed on the document. "This transaction is said to have taken place at 3:47 p.m., Keanu said, his finger tracing the time on the screen. "But at 3:47 p.m., I wasn't even in my office. I was several miles away, at another location." Keanu pulled out another document, a security log from the building where he worked. "Here," he said, showing it to the jury. "At 3:47 p.m., I was signing into the company headquarters. I was physically there, at the front desk, in person. I couldn't have committed the fraud if I wasn't even at the location where it happened." The courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor, Wallace, was visibly rattled, his jaw clenched as he tried to process what Keanu had just said. The evidence that had seemed so solid just moments ago now appeared to be deeply flawed. Keanu stepped forward, his voice growing stronger. "The prosecution has tried to paint me as someone who could easily manipulate financial records. But the truth is, I wasn't even in the position to do so. The forensic reports are wrong, and this transaction is based on a lie." Wallace opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His confidence had been shattered. The defense was exposing the truth that he hadn't anticipated. The room was filled with tension as the realization began to settle in. Keanu's calm demeanor was making an impact. He wasn't just denying the accusations, he was using concrete evidence to prove his innocence. The documents, the timestamps, the security logs, everything was stacking up in his favor. The jury, once skeptical, was now watching closely. They exchanged glances, their faces reflecting a mix of surprise and disbelief. Keanu had just pulled the rug out from under the prosecution's entire case. The prosecutor, unable to respond immediately, fidgeted at his table. He shuffled through his papers, looking for something to counter Keanu's revelations. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Keanu had exposed the flaw in the case, and there was no easy way to cover it up. The mood in the courtroom had completely shifted. What had once seemed like a guaranteed victory for the prosecution was now uncertain. The truth was on Keanu's side, and it was impossible to ignore. The prosecutor, Ethan Wallace, was visibly shaken, but he quickly recovered and stood up. He wasn't going to let Keanu's defense completely destroy his case. He cleared his throat and addressed the jury with renewed confidence. "Mr. Reeves may claim that he wasn't at the scene of the crime," Wallace said, his voice cool and calculated. "But that doesn't mean he couldn't have arranged for someone else to commit the fraud while covering his own tracks. It's easy to make it look like someone else did the work while he stays clean." Wallace's words were an attempt to regain control of the courtroom. He knew he had to cast doubt on Keanu's defense, even if it meant suggesting that someone else could have done the crime on Keanu's behalf. But Keanu wasn't intimidated. He remained calm and unshaken, knowing that Wallace's argument didn't hold up. He stood up and addressed the court.